I thought I was just cleaning dust and rust from an abandoned factory floor. But when I accidentally broke through that concrete wall, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my own family. My name is Zara Chen, and 2 years ago I thought I had my life figured out. I was working as an automotive mechanic at Morrison's auto shop, living paycheck to paycheck but proud of my independence. Then everything changed in one terrible night when my parents were killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Highway 287. The funeral costs and my father's final weeks in the ICU buried me under $23,000 in medical debt. Insurance covered most of it, but most isn't everything when you're already living on ramen noodles and generic coffee. So at 24 years old, I became a woman who worked on engines during the day and scrubbed floors at night, desperately, trying to keep my head above water. People always tell you that grief comes in stages, but they don't mention how exhaustion can numb even the deepest pain. I was running on 3 hours of sleep and pure stubbornness when Uncle Tobias called. That Tuesday morning, I almost didn't answer because I was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild. But something about the way his name kept flashing on my phone made me wipe my hands and pick up. I've always been the type of person who fixes things. Broken cars, broken appliances, broken relationships between my parents when they used to fight about money. But you can't fix everything, and some breaks leave scars that never quite heal right. After Mom and Dad died, I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Engines follow rules. They break in predictable ways. They can be repaired with the right tools and enough determination. The thing about growing up in a small town is that everyone knows everyone else's business, except when they don't. My family had always been private people, but I never thought we had secrets worth keeping. My grandfather Cornelius had worked at the old Berkshire manufacturing plant for 30 years before it closed down in 1987, 5 years before I was born. He died when I was 12, and I remembered him as a quiet man who smelled like motor oil and always had peppermints in his shirt pocket. What I didn't know then, standing in that grimy auto shop with transmission fluid under my fingernails, was that my grandfather had left me something more valuable than peppermints and childhood memories. He had left me a mystery that would change everything I thought I knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it really means to protect the people you love. All I had to do was break through the right wall to find it. Uncle Tobias had never been much of a talker, even before my parents died. He was my father's older brother, a bachelor who worked construction and showed up to family gatherings with a six-pack and awkward small talk. But that Tuesday morning, his voice sounded different. Strained, like he was forcing himself to make a call he didn't want to make. "Zara, honey, I've got a job for you if you're interested. Good money." He cleared his throat. Real good money. 3 days of industrial, cleaning at the old Berkshire plant. $2,000. I nearly dropped my socket wrench. $2,000 was more than I made in a month of night cleaning jobs. It was enough to make a serious dent in my medical debt. Maybe even get ahead on rent for once. But something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "Uncle Tobias, that's way too much money for cleaning. What's the catch?" "No catch. Just needs a deep clean before they tear it down. I got the contract through a buddy in construction. You interested or not?" When I met Uncle Tobias at the factory that evening to get the keys, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually steady hands were shaking slightly as he handed me a heavy ring of old keys and a handwritten list of cleaning supplies I'd need. "Just stick to the main factory floor," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Don't go poking around in the offices or storage areas. Just the production floor, 3 days, in and out." I studied his face in the dim light from his truck's headlights. "Uncle Tobias, are you okay? You seem nervous about something." He forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, kiddo. Just want you to do good work, you know. This could lead to more contracts." But as he climbed back into his truck, I heard him mutter something under his breath that made my blood run cold. "I just hope she doesn't find what Cornelius left behind." The Berkshire manufacturing plant squatted on the outskirts of town like a sleeping giant. 3 stories of red brick and broken windows, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better decades. The parking lot was cracked asphalt where weeds pushed through like nature was slowly reclaiming the place. Inside, my flashlight beam cut through darkness thick enough to taste. Decades of dust coated everything, from the massive industrial machines that still sat where workers had left them to the time clock by the entrance where someone had punched out for the last time in 1987. The air smelled like rust and abandonment, with an undertone of something else. Something that reminded me of my grandfather's work clothes. Walking through that factory floor for the first time, I kept thinking about the stories my grandfather used to tell me when I was little. He'd bounce me on his knee and talk about the special projects they worked on during the Cold War, how important their work was for keeping America safe. My parents always rolled their eyes and changed the subject, saying Grandpa Cornelius was just trying to make his factory job sound more exciting than it really was. But standing in that cavernous space, surrounded by machinery I couldn't identify, and workstations that looked far more sophisticated than anything you'd need for manufacturing regular consumer goods, I started to wonder if my parents had been wrong. The memory hit me without warning as I swept dust from what looked like a precision cutting station. My father in his hospital bed, barely conscious from the pain medication grabbing my hand with surprising strength. His eyes had been clearer than they'd been in days when he whispered, "The factory holds answers, Zara. When you're ready, you'll understand." I had assumed it was the morphine talking. My father had never worked at the factory. He'd been an insurance adjuster his whole career, the kind of man who wore ties and worried about paperwork. What could he possibly know about Grandpa's old workplace? But as I set up my cleaning equipment that first night, preparing for 3 days of hard work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The building felt alive somehow, like it was waiting for something. And every time I moved my flashlight beam across the factory floor, I could swear I heard my grandfather's voice echoing in the darkness, telling me stories about secrets and sacrifice and the things we do to protect the people we love. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a cleaning job. Good money for honest work. But deep down, I knew that Uncle Tobias hadn't called me because I was the best cleaner in town. He'd called me because I was Cornelius Chen's granddaughter, and somehow that mattered more than I could possibly understand. I threw myself into the cleaning with the same intensity I brought to engine repairs. Industrial strength degreaser, pressure washer, scrapers for the stubborn grime that had baked onto surfaces over decades of abandonment. The work was satisfying in a way that surprised me. Every patch of clean concrete I revealed felt like bringing something back to life. But by the afternoon of my first day, I started noticing things that didn't add up. The machinery wasn't just old manufacturing equipment. Some of it looked like precision instruments, the kind of stuff you'd find in a laboratory or research facility. And the electrical systems were far more complex than anything a regular factory would need. Conduits ran everywhere, disappearing into walls and floors like the building's nervous system was designed by someone who understood things I couldn't even imagine. The hollow sound. It was on my second day, while I was pressure washing the northeast corner of the factory floor, that I heard it. A different sound when the water hit the concrete. Not the solid thunk of water against stone, but something hollow, empty. I turned off the pressure washer and knelt down, running my hands over the wet concrete. The surface looked the same as everywhere else, but when I tapped it with the handle of my scraper, it definitely sounded different. Hollow, like there was space underneath. As the water continued to run across the floor, I watched it disappear into cracks I hadn't noticed before. Hair-thin fractures that formed a pattern. Not random damage from age and weather, but deliberate lines, straight edges, corners. Like someone had cut a door into the concrete and then sealed it so well that only water could find the seams. That evening, I called Uncle Tobias from my apartment, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, Uncle Tobias. Quick question about the factory job. Did Grandpa ever mention anything unusual about that building? Any special projects or anything like that?" The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Zara, why are you asking?" "Just curious. Some of the equipment in there looks pretty sophisticated for a regular manufacturing plant. Your grandfather was a machinist." Good with his hands, that's all. His voice had gone flat, careful. You're not poking around where you shouldn't be, are you? I told you to stick to the main floor. I am sticking to the main floor. I'm just saying the equipment looks interesting. Interesting doesn't pay your bills, kiddo. Just do the job and don't ask questions. He hung up before I could respond, and I stared at my phone, feeling more confused than ever. Uncle Tobias had never been rude to me before, never shut me down like that. And why was he so worried about me asking questions about my own grandfather? I couldn't sleep that night. Something about Uncle Tobias's reaction had lit a fire under my curiosity that no amount of exhaustion could put out. So I did what any reasonable person would do at 2 in the morning. I started digging on the internet. What I found made my blood run cold. The Berkshire manufacturing plant wasn't just some regular factory. During the Cold War, it had been contracted by the federal government for specialized manufacturing in support of national defense. The details were vague, but newspaper clippings from the 1960s and 70s mentioned classified projects and security clearances required for certain workers. And there was my grandfather's name, Cornelius Chen, listed in a 1978 article about employees receiving commendations for exceptional service to national security interests. National security, not manufacturing widgets or car parts. National security. I leaned back in my desk chair, my mind racing. What had my grandfather really been doing in that factory for 30 years? And why had my father known enough about it to mention it on his deathbed? The next morning, I was setting up my equipment for the third and final day when I heard a truck pull up outside. Through the broken windows, I saw Uncle Tobias climbing out of his pickup, looking agitated. He pushed through the factory doors like a man on a mission, his eyes scanning the work I'd done over the past 2 days. "You've been busy," he said, but it didn't sound like a compliment. "That's what you're paying me for." He walked over to the northeast corner where I'd noticed the hollow sound. The concrete was dry now, but the hairline cracks were still visible if you knew where to look. "Zara, I need you to be straight with me. Have you found anything unusual? Any old equipment or papers or anything that doesn't belong?" The way he asked the question told me he already knew the answer he was hoping for. And the way his hands were shaking told me he was terrified I might give him a different one. "Like what kind of unusual?" I asked carefully. "Just answer the question." I looked at this man who had been part of my family my entire life, who had helped carry my father's coffin just 2 years ago, who was now standing in an abandoned factory acting like I was some kind of threat. I found a section of floor that sounds hollow when you tap on it. "Right over there." I pointed to the corner. Water runs through cracks that look like they were cut deliberately. Uncle Tobias closed his eyes like I'd just told him someone had died. "Stay away from that area, Zara, I mean it. Finish cleaning the rest of the floor, and then we're done here." "Why? What's down there?" "Nothing that concerns you." But the way he said it, the fear in his voice, told me it concerned me more than anything else in my life ever had. And as I watched him hurry back to his truck, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what my family had been hiding from me, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about the people I loved. After Uncle Tobias left, I stood alone in that factory for what felt like hours, staring at the section of floor that had caused him to look like he'd seen a ghost. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pack up my equipment, collect my $2,000, and pretend this conversation had never happened. I had rent to pay, debt to clear, a life to rebuild. But the other part of my brain, the part that sounded exactly like my grandfather's voice, kept whispering the same. "Question: what if everything you've been told about your family is a lie?" I thought about my father's final words again, how clear his eyes had been when he said them. "The factory holds answers, Zara. When you're ready, you'll understand." Maybe I hadn't been ready then, drowning in grief and medical bills, but standing in that abandoned building, holding secrets that had terrified my uncle into silence, I realized I was ready now. I made my choice. I was going to break through that floor, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. Gathering my tools. First, I needed the right equipment. My cleaning supplies weren't going to cut through reinforced concrete. but I knew where to find what I needed. Morrison's auto shop had a concrete saw we used for garage floor repairs, and I still had my key from when I'd worked late the night before. The drive back to town felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every mile gave me another chance to change my mind, to turn around and pretend I'd never noticed anything unusual about that floor. But every mile also brought me closer to answers I'd been waiting my whole life to find. Breaking into my own workplace felt surreal. I knew the security system, knew which cameras had blind spots, knew exactly where Frank Morrison kept the heavy equipment. The concrete saw was exactly where I'd left it after our last garage renovation, and I loaded it into my truck along with safety goggles, a respirator, and my grandfather's old toolkit that I always kept in my glove compartment. The safety net. Before I drove back to the factory, I pulled out my phone and texted my best friend Reina Martinez, the only person in my life who knew about the cleaning job and wouldn't ask too many questions. Working late at the factory tonight. If you don't hear from me by 6 a.m., call the police and tell them to check Berkshire Manufacturing. Something's not right about this place. Reina texted back immediately. Girl, what are you getting yourself into? Want me to come with you? No. This is something I need to do alone, but I need someone to know where I am, just in case. Just in case what? Just in case Uncle Tobias was right to be scared. Breaking through. Back at the factory, I set up work lights around the hollow section of floor and put on all my safety gear. The concrete saw was loud enough to wake the dead, but the nearest neighbor was miles away. As the diamond blade bit into the concrete, throwing sparks and dust in all directions, I felt like I was performing surgery on a secret that had been buried for decades. The concrete was thicker than I'd expected, nearly 6 inches of reinforced material that had been poured to last forever. But underneath, my blade hit something different. Metal. Steel reinforcement that had been carefully placed to frame whatever was hidden below. When I finally broke through, the sound was like breaking a seal that had been holding back history itself. My flashlight beam disappeared into darkness that seemed to swallow the light, but I could make out the top of what looked like a staircase. Concrete steps leading down into a tunnel that stretched farther than my light could reach. I sat on the edge of that hole for 10 minutes, just breathing and trying to process what I'd found. This wasn't some old storage basement or forgotten utility tunnel. This was something that had been built with intention, with secrecy, with the kind of planning that suggested whatever was down there was worth hiding for nearly 40 years. Thought about my grandfather, imagining him walking down these same steps decades ago. Had he built this? Had he known I would someday find it? Was this what my father had meant about the factory holding answers? The staircase was solid, built to last. Each step was exactly the same height, with handrails that had been welded by someone who knew what they were doing. My flashlight beam revealed walls lined with electrical conduits and ventilation systems that looked far more sophisticated than anything the main factory had needed. After descending for what felt like 3 stories, the staircase opened into a tunnel. Not a rough cave or hastily dug passage, but an engineered corridor with concrete walls, proper lighting fixtures, and warning signs that made my blood run cold. Authorized personnel only. Project Nightfall. Classified. Restricted area. Deadly. Force authorized. The tunnel stretched ahead of me like a throat leading into the Earth's belly. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the space ahead was much larger than the narrow corridor I was walking through. The air smelled like metal and electricity and something else I couldn't identify, something that reminded me of the gun oil. My grandfather used to clean his hunting rifle. I checked my phone. No signal. I was completely cut off from the world above, following a path that my family had spent decades trying to keep me from finding. But I was committed now. Whatever was at the end of this tunnel, whatever my grandfather had hidden down here, I was going to face it. The tunnel curved slightly to the right, and then opened into something that made me stop breathing entirely. My flashlight beam, which had been bouncing off narrow walls for the past 10 minutes, suddenly had room to spread. I was standing at the entrance to a vast underground chamber, and as motion sensors detected my presence, banks of fluorescent lights began flickering to life. What they revealed changed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, my family, and the quiet little town I'd grown up in. I was standing in the doorway of a secret that had been waiting 40 years for Cornelius Chen's granddaughter to find it. The lights revealed a chamber the size of an airplane hangar, carved out of solid rock and reinforced with steel beams that could have supported a skyscraper. Rows upon rows of military crates stretched into the distance, each one stenciled with codes and numbers that meant nothing to me, but everything to someone who had needed to catalog an underground army's worth of equipment. This wasn't just a storage room. This was a fortress built to survive the end of the world. I walked between the rows like I was touring a museum of secrets, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. Wooden crates marked M16A1 50 units, metal containers labeled explosives, authorized personnel only. Communication equipment covered in tarps that looked like they could contact satellites or coordinate military operations across entire continents. But it was the maps that made my legs go weak. Detailed street maps of our small town, marked with positions and coordinates, strategic points highlighted in red, escape routes marked in blue, safe houses circled in green. Our quiet little community had been mapped like a battlefield, every street corner and building cataloged as if someone expected to wage war right here in the heart of America. In the center of this underground command post sat a desk that looked like mission control for a secret war. Multiple radio systems, filing cabinets with combination locks, and maps of the United States marked with locations I didn't recognize. But it was the personal items on the desk that stopped my heart completely. A framed photograph of my grandfather, in military dress uniform, standing next to a man who looked exactly like Uncle Tobias but 30 years younger. Both men were holding commendation certificates, and behind them I could see the entrance to this very chamber. The nameplate on the desk read, Colonel C. Chen, Project Nightfall Commander. Colonel, not factory worker, not machinist. Colonel. Cornelius Chen had been a military officer running a classified operation right underneath our hometown, and every adult in my family had known except me. My hands were shaking as I tried the desk drawers. The first two were locked solid, but the third one had a keyhole that looked familiar. I pulled out my grandfather's old toolkit, the one I'd carried for luck since his funeral, and found the small brass key I'd always assumed was for his toolbox. It fit perfectly. Inside the drawer, I found a leather portfolio filled with documents that read like something from a spy novel. Official military orders appointing Cornelius Chen as commander of Operation Nightfall, a Cold War program designed to establish hidden weapons caches and resistance networks in case of Soviet invasion. The dates ranged from 1962 to 1987, covering my grandfather's entire career at the factory. There were photographs of training exercises, lists of civilians who had been secretly recruited as resistance fighters, and detailed plans for guerrilla warfare in American suburbs. My quiet grandfather, who used to give me peppermints and tell me bedtime stories about brave soldiers, had actually been one of those brave soldiers. He'd spent 30 years preparing to defend our country from an invasion that never came. I was so absorbed in reading these incredible documents that I didn't hear the footsteps in the tunnel until it was too late. By the time I looked up, Uncle Tobias was standing at the entrance to the chamber, not looking surprised or angry, but relieved and exhausted, like a man who had finally been caught carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. I was hoping you'd never find this place, he said, walking slowly toward the desk. But maybe it's time you knew the truth about our family. Uncle Tobias, what is all this? Why didn't anyone ever tell me? He sat down heavily in a chair near the desk, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. Your grandfather made us promise, all of us. Your father, me, your Aunt Patricia, who moved to California and never talks about home. We swore we'd take this secret to our graves. But Dad mentioned it before he died. He told me the factory held answers. Tobias nodded sadly. Your father couldn't handle it. The weight of knowing that our quiet little town had been a potential battlefield, that your grandfather had trained half our neighbors to be guerrilla fighters. It ate him for years. That's why he started drinking. That's why he became so distant from you and your mother. You have to understand, Zara. This wasn't just about storing weapons. Your grandfather was responsible for protecting an entire region of the country. If the Soviets had invaded, if nuclear war had broken out, This facility and dozens like it were supposed to coordinate resistance efforts across the Midwest. Your grandfather wasn't just a soldier. He was a guardian, and he carried that responsibility until the day he died. I looked around the chamber with new eyes, seeing not just weapons and equipment, but a testament to sacrifice. How many people knew? In town, maybe 50 people over the years, all sworn to secrecy, all committed to the same mission. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, the government officially decommissioned most of these sites. But some of us were asked to maintain them, just in case. You've been taking care of this place all these years? Someone had to. The government promised they'd handle decommissioning, but bureaucracy moves slow. I've been coming down here once a month for 25 years, making sure everything stays secure, waiting for final orders that never seem to come. The weight of it all hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather hadn't been living a lie. He'd been living a truth so important that it required absolute secrecy. And my father hadn't been distant because he didn't love us. He'd been distant because he loved us so much that knowing about this underground world of responsibility and sacrifice had nearly crushed him. Why tell me now? I asked. Because I'm getting old, Zara. And because you have the same look in your eyes that your grandfather had. The look of someone who needs to know the truth, even when the truth is dangerous. Uncle Tobias stood up and walked to a filing cabinet I hadn't opened yet. He pulled out a thick folder and handed it to me. These are the decommissioning orders. They finally came through last month. This facility will be officially closed and the weapons removed within 60 days. After 40 years, Project Nightfall is finally over. I opened the folder and saw official government letterhead, signatures and stamps that made it all real. But the last document in the file made my breath catch. It was addressed to me. What is this? Your grandfather's final orders. He requested that if anything happened to him before decommissioning, his granddaughter Zara Chen should be given the option to oversee the final closure of the facility. He said you had the right to know what he'd spent his life protecting. As I read my name on official government documents, I realized that my grandfather had never forgotten me. Even in his most classified military work, he'd made sure I would someday understand the man he really was and the sacrifices he'd made for all of us. Standing in that underground chamber, holding government documents with my name on them, I faced the biggest decision of my life. Uncle Tobias was offering me a choice that my father had been too broken to make. Walk away from our family's legacy and let the secret die with us, or step up and help close this chapter of American history the right way. What exactly would I be signing up for? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. 6 weeks of working with federal agents to catalog everything down here, making sure the weapons are safely removed and the facility is properly sealed. It's not dangerous work, but it's detailed. Government work. They'll pay you well for it. I thought about my father, about the weight that had crushed him until he couldn't bear to look at his own family without thinking about the secrets he was keeping. Then I thought about my grandfather, who had carried that same weight with dignity and purpose for 30 years. I'll do it. The next month and a half was like living in a spy movie, except with a lot more paperwork and safety inspections. Agent Rebecca Torres from the Department of Defense became my daily companion, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had overseen the decommissioning of dozens similar facilities across the country. Your grandfather was something special, she told me on our third day working together. Most of these Cold War site commanders were career military, but Colonel Chen was different. He understood that he wasn't just storing weapons. He was storing hope. The hope that if the worst happened, Americans would have a fighting chance. Every day brought new discoveries that deepened my understanding of the man I'd thought I knew. Personal letters from grateful government officials. Photographs of training exercises where I recognized faces from around town, neighbors and teachers and shop owners who had secretly trained to be resistance fighters. A Medal of Honor that had been classified for so long that even my grandfather never got to wear it publicly. But the most amazing discovery came in the final week of cataloging. Hidden behind a false wall in my grandfather's office, Agent Torres found a collection of letters he had written but never sent. Letters addressed to me. The letters spanned from when I was 5 years old until just months before his death. In them, My grandfather had poured out all the love and pride and worry that he couldn't express while keeping his secrets. He wrote about watching me grow up, about hoping I would understand someday why he couldn't tell me about his real work, about his dreams for my future. The final letter, dated just 3 months before he died, brought me to tears. My dear Zara, if you are reading this, then you have found your way to the truth that I spent my life protecting. I hope you understand that everything I did, every secret I kept, was to ensure that you would grow up in a world where freedom wasn't something you had to fight for in your own backyard. You are stronger than your father, braver than you know, and I have no doubt that whatever choice you make about this legacy will be the right one. The greatest honor of my life wasn't serving my country, it was being your grandfather. The government's payment for my work was more generous than I had dared to hope. Not only did they clear my entire medical debt, but they also provided what they called a family service recognition payment that left me with enough money to go back to school, start my own auto repair business, or do whatever I wanted with my life for the first time since my parents died. But the money wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure was understanding where I came from and who I really was. One of the most unexpected gifts came when Agent Torres connected me with other families who had been part of Project Nightfall. Turns out I had relatives I'd never known about, descendants of my grandfather's brother who had worked similar assignments in other parts of the country. Within 3 months, I was getting Christmas cards from cousins in Oregon and Colorado, people who shared my grandfather's sense of duty and my own stubborn determination to see things through. My Aunt Patricia, who I'd barely spoken to since childhood, called me for the first time in years. "I'm sorry we kept this from you, honey," she said. "Your grandfather made us promise, but I always wondered if we were doing the right thing. Seeing how you handled all this, I know he would be proud." On the last day of the decommissioning, I stood alone in the empty chamber one final time before they sealed it forever. The weapons were gone, the equipment removed, the maps and documents transferred to government archives. But the sense of my grandfather's presence was stronger than ever. I understood now why my father had struggled with this knowledge. It's overwhelming to learn that your quiet family life was built on such monumental secrets, that the people who raised you were heroes in ways you never imagined. But unlike my father, I felt honored to carry this knowledge rather than burdened by it. 6 months later, I was running my own auto repair shop, specializing in vintage cars and complex engine rebuilds. I named it Chen's Precision Motors, using the mechanical skills my grandfather had taught me and the attention to detail I'd learned from cataloging government secrets. But more than that, I carried myself differently now. I understood that I came from a family of people who did difficult things because they needed doing, who kept faith with commitments even when it cost them everything. I learned that family secrets aren't always about shame or things we need to hide from. Sometimes they're about protection, about love so deep that it requires sacrifice. My grandfather didn't keep secrets from me because he didn't trust me. He kept them because he loved me enough to carry that weight alone so that I could grow up free. The greatest gift he left me wasn't the underground facility or the government recognition or even the money that changed my life. It was the understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is loving people so much that you'll do whatever it takes to protect them, even if they never know what you sacrificed. I went into that factory thinking I was just cleaning up someone else's mess. I came out understanding that I was the granddaughter of a man who had spent 30 years making sure that America would never become anyone else's mess. And now, every time I face a difficult decision or a challenging problem, I ask myself what Colonel Cornelius Chen would do. Whatever it takes to protect the people you love and the principles you believe in. That's the real legacy he left me. And it's a legacy I'll carry with pride for the rest of my life.